The warnings had been clear. The locals spoke of the forgotten woods. In hushed tones, their words thick with superstition and fear. Daniel, though, wasn't one for ghost stories. He stood at the edge of the trail, his backpack slung over one shoulder, surveying the towering trees before him. The air was crisp, the sky an endless stretch of blue, and for all their talk of strange disappearances, the forest ahead seemed nothing more than an ordinary patch of wilderness. A challenge, sure, but no more dangerous than the other remote trails he'd conquered. He tightened the straps on his pack, adjusted the brim of his hat, and set off. Each step carried him deeper into the forest, the gravel of the trail crunching rhythmically beneath his boots. He welcomed the solitude. It was part of why he came here. The silence had a way of quieting the noise in his head, the constant rush of thoughts that never quite seemed to slow down. Out here, away from the buzzing city and its suffocating crowds, he could finally breathe. The trail started off clear, marked by signs at the entrance, but the deeper Daniel ventured, the more it seemed to dissolve into the landscape. Thick underbrush crept closer to the path, trees knotted together overhead, forming a canopy that blotted out the sun. He checked his GPS, more out of habit than concern, but the signal was strong. The map showed a straightforward path that looped around the forest, promising to lead him back by dusk. Hours passed, the quiet turning heavy, almost oppressive. Daniel wasn't sure when he first noticed it, the sensation of being watched. He shook it off as nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him. It was easy to get spooked when you were alone in the middle of nowhere. Still, his pace quickened, as if his legs were responding to some unspoken urgency his mind hadn't yet acknowledged. He came across the first carving just after noon. It was etched deep into the bark of a towering oak, sharp lines cutting into the surface like an old wound. The symbol was unfamiliar, angular, and strange, resembling some ancient rune. Daniel stopped and ran his fingers over the grooves, feeling the rough texture beneath his skin. There were more carvings like it on the surrounding trees, scattered around him in no discernible pattern. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. What were they? His pulse quickened slightly as he took a few steps back, studying the carvings. He had seen plenty of graffiti on his hikes before, names carved into tree trunks, hearts with initials. But this was different. It felt older, more deliberate, like whoever had marked these trees had done so for a reason. He checked his GPS again. Nothing. The signal was gone, the screen showing only a vague outline of the forest without any clear indication of his location. Daniel cursed under his breath, shaking the device as if that might somehow bring the signal back. But no matter how many times he refreshed the screen, the map remained blank, the small arrow that represented him frozen in place. He wasn't far off the trail, was he? A creeping sense of unease settled in his gut. He could still retrace his steps. Maybe it was time to head back while he still had daylight. But as he glanced over his shoulder, the trail he'd followed all morning seemed to have vanished, swallowed up by the dense forest. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows that danced in the fading afternoon light. The familiar landmarks he'd mentally noted along the way, the fallen log by the creek, the fork in the path, were nowhere to be seen. Daniel's heart raced. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. He'd been in situations like this before. Stay calm. Retrace your steps. You're just disoriented. He pulled out his compass, but the needle spun aimlessly, as if the magnetic field in the area had gone haywire. He blinked in disbelief, giving the compass a small shake. Nothing. It was like the forest itself had decided to twist the laws of nature just to confuse him. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above, and in that moment, Daniel realized how still the forest had been. There were no birds, no animals, no sounds at all aside from the wind and his own breathing. The silence felt heavy now, like a weight pressing against his ears. He could almost hear it. The absence of everything. Panic scratched at the edges of his mind, but he pushed it down. He wouldn't let fear take over. He could figure this out. He'd been on hundreds of hikes in forests far more remote than this. All he had to do was keep moving, keep looking for the trail, and soon enough, he'd find his way out. But as he turned and started walking, the carvings seemed to follow him. More of them appeared on the trees, their sharp, ancient lines crisscrossing the bark. Each one felt like an accusation, as if the forest was watching him, marking his every move. What were these symbols? He didn't have time to think about it. He just needed to get out. The light was fading fast now, the sun barely visible through the thick canopy overhead. Shadows stretched long and dark across the forest floor, making it harder to see where he was going. His footsteps felt louder, more intrusive, each crunch of leaves underfoot a reminder of how alone he was. Daniel quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't lost. He couldn't be. He just needed to keep moving. He needed to... The whisper came so faintly that at first he thought he imagined it. A soft sound carried on the wind, just out of earshot. He stopped, straining to listen, but the forest had returned to its unnerving silence. He shook his head, rubbed his eyes, and continued forward, his pulse quickening with every step. But the deeper he went, the more he began to feel it. A presence in the woods, something unseen but watching, something waiting. Daniel's breath came in short bursts as he pushed deeper into the woods. Each step felt heavier, more labored, as if the forest were dragging him down, rooting him to the ground. The fading light barely filtered through the trees, casting the forest in a twilight that made the world around him seem unreal, like a place caught between night and day, between memory and nightmare. He stopped to catch his breath, the quiet pressing in around him like a weight. The unease that had been gnawing at him since he lost the trail had grown into something else, something closer to panic. He pulled out his phone, hoping against hope that a signal had returned, but the screen remained blank, the battery already beginning to drain from his constant checks. He cursed under his breath and pocketed it again. The compass had been no help either, its needle spinning uselessly in his hand. The wind shifted, a cool gust rustling the leaves overhead. And then, faintly, from somewhere in the distance, he heard it. A whisper. Daniel froze, his body instinctively tensing. He told himself it was the wind playing tricks on his mind, the rustling of the leaves blending with the sounds of his own anxious thoughts. But there it was again, a whisper, soft, barely audible, and unmistakable. Daniel. The sound of his own name seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment Daniel couldn't move. His mind struggled to make sense of it. Who could possibly know his name out here? He was alone. He hadn't seen another person since he entered the woods. Daniel. The voice was barely more than a breath, but it was there, calling him from somewhere just beyond the trees. His throat tightened and he strained to hear more, standing perfectly still, his breath shallow and sharp in the silence. The voice sounded familiar, like a memory struggling to break free, soft and soothing, but tinged with something more, something he couldn't quite place. He shook his head. This isn't real. You're just imagining things. Fatigue and fear were playing tricks on him, warping the forest into something more sinister than it really was. But as he stood there, the whispers came again, louder this time, insistent. Daniel. His heart skipped a beat. This time, the voice wasn't just familiar. It was intimate, a voice he hadn't heard in years but knew as well as his own. His mother. The realization struck him like a physical blow. His mother's voice, soft and comforting, the way she'd called to him when he was a child, when he was lost or afraid. But that was impossible. She'd been dead for 5 years, buried in a plot on the other side of the country. Daniel's mind raced, the logical part of him scrambling for an explanation. It's not her. It can't be. It's the wind, the forest, your mind playing tricks on you. But the voice called again, more clearly this time, as though she were standing just out of sight. "Daniel, this way." He swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat making it difficult. His mind screamed for him to turn around, to ignore the voice and keep moving. But something deep inside him, a quiet, desperate part, wanted to believe it, wanted to follow. Maybe it really is her, somehow. Maybe this is her way of guiding him, showing him the way out. Without thinking, he found himself stepping forward toward the voice. The rational part of him resisted, but his body moved of its own accord, drawn by the sound. Each step was slower than the last, hesitation creeping in, but the voice urged him forward, gentle but insistent. "Daniel, keep going." He followed the sound, moving deeper into the forest, his eyes scanning the darkening underbrush for any sign of movement. The path ahead was unclear, branches and leaves crunching underfoot as the shadows thickened around him. The voice seemed to drift through the trees, always just ahead of him, always just out of reach. His heart pounded harder in his chest with every step, fear and hope intertwining, pulling him in opposite directions. The deeper he went, the more he noticed how quiet the forest had become. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of insects. Only the voice. The whisper grew louder now, more familiar and more urgent. "Daniel, this way." It was almost like a song, the way it weaved through the trees, the cadence of his name soft and rhythmic. A lullaby he'd long forgotten. His mind flashed with memories of childhood, his mother's face, the warmth of her hand on his back as she soothed him to sleep. The memories filled him with a strange kind of comfort, though it was tinged with something darker, something he couldn't quite name. Just a little farther. The voice seemed so close now. He was certain he'd find her if he kept going, just a few more steps, just around the next tree. He could almost see her in his mind, standing there in the clearing, her arms open, waiting for him. How could it be? He stopped suddenly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked around, his heart thudding in his chest. The trees seemed to loom closer, their trunks impossibly wide, their branches twisting above him like a cage. And yet, despite the growing sense of dread in his gut, the voice pulled him onward. "Daniel, come." He stumbled forward, his foot catching on a root, sending him sprawling into the dirt. His palms scraped the rough ground, and he winced as pain shot through his wrists. The taste of blood filled his mouth as he bit down hard on his tongue. The voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. "Don't leave me." His mind snapped back to the present, reality clawing at him. His mother was dead. She wasn't here. She couldn't be here. Daniel sat up, clutching his head, trying to shake off the feeling that had wrapped around him like a fog. He was losing control. His thoughts raced, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't rested for hours. That had to be it. He was hallucinating, losing himself to the wilderness and the growing terror in his chest. But the voice came again, and this time there was no mistaking the note of desperation in it. "Please, Daniel, I'm here. Don't leave me." He wanted to scream, to yell at the forest to stop, to let him go, but his voice caught in his throat. The rational part of him begged to turn back, to find his way out, to stop following the voice that couldn't be real. But something stronger, something primal, urged him on. He stood slowly, wiping the dirt from his palms, and forced his legs to move forward again, step by step, following the voice deeper into the darkness. The deeper Daniel ventured, the darker the forest grew. The trees, gnarled and ancient, seemed to lean in on him, closing off any hint of the sky above. The only light came from his dying flashlight, its beam flickering with every step. His heartbeat had settled into a dull throb in his chest, his thoughts now consumed by the voice, his mother's voice, guiding him deeper into this forsaken place. "Daniel, keep going." The words echoed in his head, tugging him forward. He wasn't sure how long he'd been walking. Time had lost its meaning. Hours could have passed, or maybe only minutes. The forest seemed to twist around him, shifting in ways he couldn't quite understand. Every step felt as though it carried him further from any semblance of reality, and yet closer to something he couldn't turn away from. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. An outline in the darkness. A structure. Daniel stopped, his breath catching in his throat. There, through the dense underbrush, stood a Anu cabin. It was barely visible at first, shrouded in shadows and overgrown with vines, as if the forest had long ago decided to reclaim it. The sight of it sent a chill crawling up his spine. Something about it was wrong, so profoundly wrong. The cabin stood in stark contrast to the rest of the wilderness, like a scar on the landscape. It felt misplaced, unnatural, as though it didn't belong here. Daniel's stomach twisted, a deep unease settling in. But despite the instinctive fear clenching his gut, the voice, her voice, urged him forward. "This way. You're almost there." With trembling hands, Daniel lifted the beam of his flashlight toward the cabin, its dim light washing over rotted wood and shattered shingles. The cabin was small, crooked, barely holding together. There were no windows, just a single door at the front, hanging slightly ajar. And then he saw it. The blood. It streaked the door in thick, dark lines, smeared as though someone, or something, had been dragged inside. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea rolling through him. Daniel's hands shook. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn around, to run. But something stronger than fear, something that had burrowed deep into his mind, pulled him toward that door. She was waiting for him. Slowly, hesitantly, he stepped forward. The air around the cabin was thick, suffocating, and smelled of rot. As he reached for the door, his fingertips grazed the blood-stained wood. He hesitated, bile rising in his throat. What had happened here? The voice called again, so close now, so real, and his heart surged with a twisted hope. He pushed the door open. Inside, the darkness was near complete. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic, trembling beams of light across the room. The stench of decay hit him like a wall, thick and choking, the sour smell of rotting food mingling with something far worse, something primal, metallic. Blood. Daniel gagged, covering his mouth, fighting the urge to turn and run. But what he saw inside rooted him to the spot. The floor was littered with the remnants of others who had come before him. Torn backpacks and boots, frayed clothing, mold-covered sleeping bags, all scattered haphazardly across the ground. A rusted camping stove sat in one corner, next to a pile of rotting food, barely recognizable under the layers of mildew and dirt. But that wasn't the worst of it. Among the scattered belongings were bones, small, fragile, too many to count. They were old, brittle, covered in dust and decay, as though the cabin had swallowed the lives of those who had once carried them. Daniel's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. He stepped forward, his foot catching on something heavy. He looked down and saw it. A journal, its pages stained and torn. With trembling hands, he bent down and picked it up, opening it to the last entry. The handwriting was erratic, slanted, as if written in a frenzy. There is no escape. She calls to us. We are drawn to her like moths to flame. The forest, it's alive. It won't let us leave. I can hear her now, even as I write this. She's closer. So much closer. God help me, I can't stop hearing her. The writing trailed off into an ink blot, as though the writer had been interrupted, the final words unfinished. Daniel dropped the journal, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The voice called again, louder now, as though it was inside the room with him. "Daniel, come closer." His heart pounded violently in his chest. What was this place? What had happened to the people who came here before him? The blood on the door, the bones on the floor, everything pointed to one horrific truth. The forest didn't just claim people, it consumed them. Daniel turned, frantic, searching for the door, but when his eyes landed on the spot where the door had been, there was nothing, just the smooth, unbroken wall of the cabin. The door had vanished. "No, no, no, no," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling, his hands clawing at the wall where the door had been only moments before. How could it be gone? He pounded on the wood, desperate, panic overtaking him, but there was no response, no sound, no escape. His flashlight flickered again, and in the dim light, Daniel saw something in the corner of the room. An altar. It was crudely built, fashioned from bones and sticks, twisted into a macabre shrine. On it sat strange ancient artifacts, small idols carved from stone and bone, etched with the same symbols he had seen on the trees outside. The carvings seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as though they were alive. His mother's voice came again, but now it was frantic, filled with panic. "Daniel, you have to leave. Now get out. Get out." Her voice pierced through the fog in his mind, breaking through the pull that had drawn him into the cabin. Daniel stumbled back, his heart racing, his hands slick with sweat. But how could he leave? There was no door, no way out. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air growing thicker, suffocating. The voice pleaded now, desperate. "Please, Daniel. You have to leave. They'll come for you. Don't let them take you. Don't let the forest take you." Daniel's mind reeled. He staggered toward the wall, running his hands frantically over its surface, searching for any crack, any sign of escape. But the walls were solid, the door gone, and the voice, his mother's voice, was fading, growing weaker. And then, for the first time, he felt the presence, not just in the air or in the whispers, but around him, in the cabin, watching. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, pressing in around him. Something ancient, something far beyond his understanding, stirred in the darkness, and Daniel realized with a sickening clarity that the forest wasn't just alive, it was waiting. The carvings on the altar glowed faintly in the gloom, the strange symbols shifting, twisting, as though they were watching him. And then the voice was gone. All that remained was the suffocating silence, the weight of the forest pressing in on him from all sides, the walls of the cabin sealing him in. He was alone, alone with the ancient presence that now filled the room. Daniel sank to his knees, his mind unraveling. Was it real? Had any of it been real? The door, the voice, the forest, they all seemed like fragments of a nightmare he couldn't wake from. His vision blurred, the weight of exhaustion pulling him down. But as his eyes closed, one last thought clawed at his mind. It wasn't the forest that was trapping him. It was something far older, far darker, something that had always been waiting for him. When they found him, it was a miracle he was still breathing. Daniel lay curled beneath a massive oak tree, barely recognizable, his skin pale and sunken, his clothes shredded and caked with mud. His body was gaunt, a hollowed-out version of the man he had been when he first disappeared into the forgotten woods. His eyes, once full of life, were dull, fixed on something far beyond the forest's edge. The search party had combed the woods for months, turning up nothing but rumors and whispers. But that morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the mist, one of the volunteers spotted something in the underbrush. A flash of red, the frayed remains of Daniel's jacket. It led them to him, to the place where he had collapsed, like the woods had finally decided to let him go. But even as they approached, there was something about the way he lay there, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of his chest, that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. The forest was too quiet, the trees too still. Daniel's lips moved, barely more than a twitch. His voice, weak and broken, escaped in a hoarse whisper as the rescue workers crouched beside him. One of them leaned in closer, straining to hear. "She's still calling." The words came out in a rasp, so soft that at first they thought they'd misheard. But Daniel repeated it, this time with a bit more strength, his eyes flickering open. They weren't looking at the people around him, though. His gaze was fixed on the woods, on the endless, suffocating trees that had held him captive for so long. "She's still calling. I can't leave her." The rescuers exchanged uneasy glances, their radios buzzing with reports from the rest of the team. There were no signs of anyone else in the forest, no trace of the other hikers, no clues as to what had happened to Daniel. And yet, he spoke as though someone had been with him all this time. They tried to pull him up, to get him on his feet, but Daniel resisted. His body was limp, like a rag doll, his legs giving out beneath him. His lips cracked as he repeated the same phrase over and over, his voice growing weaker with each word. "She's still calling." The trees around them felt oppressive, their shadows long and reaching. Even though the team had finally found him, none of them felt safe. The forest was watching. They could feel it. Every instinct screamed at them to leave, to take Daniel and get out before the forest itself closed in on them again. One of the men, a paramedic, tried to reassure him, tried to tell him he was safe now. "You're okay, we're taking you home, Daniel. You're safe." But Daniel shook his head weakly, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed far too deep to come from anything they could see. "I can't leave her. She won't let me." The paramedic frowned, leaning closer. Who won't let you leave?" Daniel's breath hitched in his throat. His lips trembled as his hand weakly reached toward the forest, his fingers twitching as if reaching for something. Someone, just beyond their sight. "My mother." His voice cracked raw with exhaustion and something darker, something desperate. "She's still out there. She needs me." One of the rescuers stepped back, glancing at the others. The air around them felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. They had heard stories about this place, tales passed down from the town for as long as anyone could remember. The Forgotten Woods wasn't just a forest. It was a trap, a place that whispered to people, lured them in, and never let them go. And now, standing here with Daniel, broken, half mad, and clinging to some impossible truth, they began to believe it. Daniel struggled in their grasp, his frail body shaking with effort as he tried to crawl back toward the trees. His voice rose, frantic now, hoarse from the strain. "I have to go back. I have to. She's still calling." The rescuers held him down, trying to keep him still, but Daniel fought harder, his hands clawing at the dirt, his eyes wild. His strength, though fleeting, was driven by something more than survival. He didn't want to be saved. He didn't want to leave. His voice broke through the stillness, ragged and filled with terror. "You don't understand. She's not done with me. But his words trailed off into a choked sob as his body went limp in their arms. For a moment, the forest seemed to exhale, the weight of its presence pressing in on all of them. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating. They bundled him onto the stretcher, his body still convulsing with quiet sobs, his eyes locked on the woods. Even as they began the long trek back to the edge of the forest, he never stopped whispering, "She's still calling. She's still calling." The paramedic tried to comfort him, telling him they were almost out, that he was safe, but the words fell on deaf ears. Daniel's eyes never wavered from the tree line, his lips moving in that same hypnotic rhythm, repeating the words like a mantra, like a prayer. "She's still calling. She needs me. She won't let me leave." It wasn't until they finally broke through the forest's edge into the clearing where the town waited that Daniel's whispering stopped. His body went slack, his eyes closing as if in surrender, and for the first time in hours his breathing calmed. But the relief that washed over the rescuers was short-lived. Even as they placed him into the waiting ambulance, Daniel's eyes fluttered open one last time. His voice, so faint now that it was almost lost in the wind, drifted out into the quiet morning air. "I have to go back. She's still calling." The doors of the ambulance closed with a hollow thud, but for the rescuers who remained behind, the silence was unbearable. They turned, looking back at the forest, its towering trees swaying gently in the breeze. There, just beyond the first line of trees, they could almost hear it. A soft, distant whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was there, carried on the wind, faint and familiar, like the echo of a memory they couldn't quite place. And for the first time, they began to wonder if Daniel wasn't the only one who had heard it. The forest never truly let him go. Even as they drove him away, Daniel's final words echoed in the minds of the rescuers, a haunting refrain that followed them long after they had left the woods behind. "She's still calling." And Daniel would never forget.